Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our presentation, Lights, Camera, Action. We're going to be talking this morning about, it's pretty much an ongoing controversy for the last couple of years about the proliferation of body cameras on officers and dash cameras with officers. The question has come up when we have a use of force incident. We're going to interview the officers to what happened. Do we let the officer look at their body camera footage? Do we not let him do it? And we're going to just go through that this morning. I've got a couple of examples of what other departments have done and what some state laws have done. Tim's going to talk a little bit more about that in more detail, and then Lance here is going to finish up with some real-life examples. Here's who we are. Let me go back to that one. I'm Brad Lawrence. I'm the Legal Division Chief at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, Georgia. Mr. Miller here on my far left is also a legal instructor there at Glencoe. And Mr. Lance LaRusso is a litigator up near Atlanta, defending police officers and a whole host of other things. So instead of giving everybody this lengthy bio, I just came up with this. It's like pictures for early in the morning. So who we are, it's like a connect the dots type thing. So, okay, we're all three lawyers. We got that out of the way. Which one was a former Marine Corps judge? That'd be that guy. Two of us were former cops, me and Mr. LaRusso. I'm a reserve JAG, and then the big one, somebody loves cat videos, but I'm not going to say which one it is. It may be more than one.
Clearly, it's me.
We can talk later. So here's what we're going to talk about in a use of force, and some of this is review about use of force in general. What are the courts going to look at in a use of force case? Of course, it's going to be Bryan versus Connor, that brand new 28-year-old case that keeps popping up. We're going to talk a little bit about human performance and what happens with the human body and the human mind and the perceptions when a police officer or anybody for that matter is under stress and how that can affect their perception and their recall of what happened. We're going to talk a little bit about the myths and realities of body-worn cameras. And there's a huge misconception, I think, among the public, certainly, and among, I think, judges and certainly jurors, unless they're educated about what body cameras can and can't do. There's some benefits, but there are also some drawbacks. And then we're going to discuss the options, the pros and cons of each approach, whether you let the officer look at the videotape before making a statement or whether you forbid it, whether you maybe give the officer the choice. Each one has got its own good and maybe not so good points. And then hopefully for all of you come up at the end in your departments, how do you come up with an informed decision about what's best for your agency and your officers and your community? And again, there is no perfect answer, just like in the use of force, right? The courts have said there is no perfect answer when choosing force options. There's no perfect answer for this question about body-worn cameras and video either. Here's my disclaimer for FLETC. They make me say this. We're for DHS. We are not in the business of telling anybody what to do with policy. That's not what we do. We train people on the law and give options, basically. I get asked a lot of questions about use of force policies, which I'm willing to give my private 2 cents on, but we don't officially endorse any policies. So this is just hopefully to help you all make the decision that's best for you and your department. So Bryan versus Connor, how do we tell a force is reasonable? The court looks at the totality of the circumstances. The entire picture that was known to that officer when he or she applied force. At that moment, what did the officer know? The court is going to take that and look at it through the perspective of the reasonable officer. Not the perfect officer, because I don't think that person exists. I'm sure I thought I was at one point when I was younger and knew everything in the world, but there is not one. And it's also not the perspective of the reasonable person, right? And that gets lost sometimes on these news shows where they've got people about voicing their opinion who've never worn a badge. So that's not the lens that the court looks at it through. And then on the scene, this is important because the court has said we're not going to allow court to look at 20/20 hindsight when judging an officer's use of force. You can't go back and look at the video and slow it down frame by frame. Now that's tried a lot, but the court shouldn't allow that to come into evidence. Because we could all go back and even our own instances that we've used force on or we've done any kind of case on, we can always go back the next day and think, I probably could have done that a different way, maybe a little bit better way. But the court won't do that. They're going to look at what happened and what the officer knew at the time, and no more stuff's added to it later. And then finally, without regard to the officer's subjective intent. So They're just going to look at it through the lens of a reasonable officer. If this officer hated the person that he used force upon and still acted reasonably, the fact that he didn't like that person is not going to be introduced into evidence. It's not going to go around saying that, but it shouldn't come into the use of force calculus. So here's kind of where the body cameras come in. It's, the court's going to look at all the facts and circumstances that the officer was aware of at the time force was used. And where this comes in is human memory is fallible. So especially in a high stress incident. So if I use force, I might remember certain things. The body camera might pick up certain other things that I maybe not was even aware of. So we're going to discuss that a little bit. And you can't justify your use of force with what you found out later. So if there's a use of force incident, the officer did what he or she did, and then later on finds out that the subject of the force had threatened to kill cops, maybe he was arrested 3 days before for beating up another person sort of violent. If we didn't know that at the time, we can't use it. And my argument is body cameras are the same way. If we didn't know what the body camera said, it's not going to be usable. So what about the cameras? We've got the body-worn cameras, which are exploding right now. You go up on the second floor, and how many booths are promoting their body cameras? I lost count at, I think, 8, and I didn't even go through the whole thing. So they're great tools. I wish I'd had one when I was working the street. It would have been wonderful, just even for reminiscing videos, but to go back and look at your reports and think, okay, this is what happened. Dash cameras, those have been around for a lot longer, but some of these state laws and some of these policies also allow the officer to look at dash cameras or other cameras before they make their statement. And of course, security cameras, that's been around for a while. We poll businesses around the area to say, hey, did your camera pick something up? And then the big one also, right, cell phone, go to YouTube and look up police use of force, and what are you going to come up with? Hundreds and hundreds of bystanders doing this, right? Maybe a cop's fighting somebody in the street, and what are they doing? They're filming it. So that's out there. Should an officer be allowed to look at those things before they make the report? I don't have the answer, but we're going to discuss some of those things. So there's a mistaken argument out there that the human brain is like a video camera. And I think most of us know that that's not the case, but most of society, and certainly people on the news that I've seen, they don't get that. And I've even read some papers from supposedly knowledgeable folks who come and say, well, officers under stress can be fallible, but the gold standard is to go back and look at that tape. That's going to tell us what happened. Is that right? It might be a perspective of what happened, but how many perspectives could there be? And the one we care about is who? That officer who ended up using force. And there could be 4 of them. Each one has their own perspective of what he or she perceived and went through and knew about this incident before whatever happened. So here's some of the myths. Everybody sees what really occurs. Now, we think we do. There's been hundreds and hundreds of studies about this, but we perceive something, we think that's what really happened. Another person, another officer over here might have perceived something completely different. And we know that how? From taking reports, and you have 4 witnesses. Do they all say the same thing, typically? No. And if, in fact, if they do say the same thing, that could be a red flag, right? That maybe they got together and got their story straight before they talked with the investigator. Everybody sees everything that occurs. No, it's not true either. The human mind can only do so many things at once, and under stress, a lot of your senses either disappear or they're altered in some way. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, too. Everybody processes information in the same way. We're all individuals. Even if you narrow the universe down to police officers, it's a small percentage of the population. But everybody, even with the same training, the same kind of experience, is going to see things differently, just because we're individual people. We're not robots. We're not the same. We're not cameras. And then here's the big one. Everybody remembers exactly what happened in an incident, especially a high stress one. It's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to some other folks. You go through an arrest, maybe a guy resists arrest or fights, or you're talking about something that happened, and afterwards you debrief with your buddies. And have you ever had it where one of them says, hey, yeah, when he reached down and pulled that beer bottle up from the side of the curb, maybe you didn't see that at all. It's like, were you at the same call I was at? Because I don't remember that. That's not at all how I saw it. So people, officers, don't see things the same way. Neither do cameras. Cameras don't perceive what we see. And that's the next two. As the officer is, say, addressing a person 15 feet away, and there's, the dash cams are different. Some are in the glasses, or some that go on your lapel, some go on your middle of your chest. What happens if the officer's got a gun on somebody and his camera's right here? Well, it's going to get a nice view of the back of his hand and maybe some recoil if he ends up firing the gun, but that's it. The officer is only 8 inches higher from the camera, and it's a completely different view. Not to mention, what's the field of view on some of these cameras? They're pretty wide, 120 degrees, maybe even more. So it's not what the eye sees. The eye's pretty narrow when we're focused on something. And then the flip side of that is, well, Officer Lawrence, look at the camera, look at the videotape. Clearly, the suspect did A, B, and C. Does that mean I saw that? It doesn't at all. The camera is a fixed view. It looks at one thing all the time. It's always watching. What does a human eye do? I'm looking around, and if we're trained, what do we look at typically with a person first? Their hands. So if I'm focused on the hands, I might not see his face, or might not see who's behind him, things like that. The camera picks all that up. The officer might not, hopefully. And then this one, this is very common in a high-stress shooting incident. Shooting's probably one of the most high-stress things we can go through. And this is not new information. Going back years and years and years, is anecdotal reports of an officer shooting, emptying their magazine, and they swear they fired 2 rounds. And they go back and they show them the scene and say, look, here's your spent casings, here's your empty magazine, and no, I shot 2 rounds. And it's hard to get our memory, and we know what happened because we were there. It's hard to be confronted with evidence that might not be what really happened. It's normal. There's nothing wrong with it. And hopefully, I know we at FLETC, we train our new students in the 3rd day or so in their legal use of force, and then we have an 8-hour block of additional use of force stuff, and then human performance factors. What happens to a person under stress? So hopefully our graduates at least have been exposed to the fact that they're not going to remember every single thing, and that's okay. You're not losing your mind, or you're not lying. That's one of the things that happens in the news, where an officer's report differs from the video. What do they say? Well, the officer's clearly making it up. They're lying about it. Well, that's probably not the case. They probably just like what they remember. And here are some of the effects that stress has on the human nervous system. Diminished sound, and these are all survival mechanisms for the human. Under stress, you tend to focus on what the threat is, what's important. Is there a saber-toothed tiger coming over the hill that's going to try to eat me? Is this bad guy who won't show me his hands? What's he doing? It's the same effect. So we might not hear noises, because typically a noise isn't going to hurt us. But the tunnel vision is the opposite of that. I can see all of you in the room right now, but if somebody were to make something threatening move, I'm going to tunnel in on that and focus on what they're doing. And I might not even see anything that happens outside that view. Automatic pilot, officers do as they're trained. That's why it's so important to train realistically, because under stress, your body and your brain is going to do what it's been taught to do over and over and over again. You don't have time to sit here and reason it out. You got a split second to make these calls. Slow motion time. You've read incidents of officers who in a shooting, they can see the casings go out of the ejection port, like it was a movie in slow motion. We see that a lot. That's a big one, memory loss, right? And there's a lot of research we'll talk about in a second. The 40-hour sleep cycle, and your memories are more concretely situated in your mind and your memory after 48 hours. I had a buddy yesterday who's a PhD psychologist. He said, some of the research says that might not be true, but certainly we have memory loss in stressful incidents. We're not going to remember everything. And where that comes up is when the camera, does the camera have memory loss? No, it doesn't. But it might not show everything that happened. I think Lance is going to discuss that a little bit, some of the pitfalls of some of the camera systems. Intrusive thoughts. You're thinking about, oh my God, what's my family going to end up with? Am I going to be killed, wounded? Is my family gonna be okay? All kinds of stuff can happen to get in your memory. And then time speed up, people might hear louder sounds. You might freeze, the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome. Hopefully we can train that last one out of most folks, but these are all things that were self-reported during a study involving what happens under use of force stress situations. So here's what we think we see, or more likely what the public, what the media, what the judge, what the jury, what the prosecutor might think we see if we've got this off a dash cam grab. And then, science has shown and studies have shown that is probably what we really can see. The human eye cannot focus on much more at once, certainly under stress. And I like this, if you hold your thumb out, what you can see covered by your thumb is what you can focus on at any one time during a stressful situation. So, unfortunately, the body cameras or the dash cameras won't focus in like that, like our eyes do. So, when folks are looking at the camera view, it's completely different what the officer might experience by being human. So in that tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving event, which is right out of the Supreme Court, that's where that language comes from, it's great for officers. The specific actions of what the officer, what he's focused on is going to dictate what's in the report. If they're focused on this person not showing their hands, somebody else is doing something over here, another officer's fighting somebody, they might not even know what happened, but the camera's going to pick that up. And it causes problems for folks who don't understand these differences in cameras and people and the way they work. So here's what I mentioned a second ago. What does the science say? And this is not new, but I think in the last 3 or 4 years, this has gained traction in departments. And I know in Georgia, I was talking to a GBI agent yesterday, told me that a couple of agencies in Georgia have put this 48-hour requirement into their policies where an officer's involved in a use of force incident. They've got 48 hours, 2 sleep cycles is what kind of the standard answer I've gotten is, to have their memories gel before they're interviewed by internal affairs, by the investigator, by GBI, by another agency who's going to talk to them. Not every policy, not every department has that policy, but that's a pretty good standard from what I've been told. And that's regardless of video. That's separate from this video issue. That's just so you can get all the things that, you go to sleep and you wake up and you might remember something else. It's kind of like going through, do a scene walkthrough a couple of days later. If it happened near a restaurant outside an alley, a couple of days later, we walk the officer through that scene at the same time of day that the incident occurred, and oh, I forgot, this happened. Or they might get a smell of the alley and the dumpster full of food, and those smells can trigger memories. So what the officer writes down immediately after the use of force is not necessarily the final say about what really happened or what they're going to remember later. And then if we live through and experience a use of force incident, and then we come back later and watch a video from either our body camera, dash camera, security camera, another officer's camera, the question is, can that influence what I remember? And I've seen this portrayed in some policies. The ACLU's got several of the chapters have got web presences that talk about this issue. And the way they spin it is an officer watches a video after the incident and then they change their story to fit the video. They're lying. And you and I both know that is a very, very rare situation. What happens is, what the danger is, I think science has shown, is that if you watch a video, you don't even know that you didn't experience it. That memory from the video sinks into your subconscious and you think it really happened. That's one of the dangers proponents of interview first, video later point to. And we're not doing it on purpose. It seeps in there, and it's been shown through science that you can, if you watch something, especially under stress, you think it really happened. It might not be the case. So here's what we're kind of here to talk about. Should the officers be allowed to watch any video before they make their statement, before they're interviewed in a use of force incident? Or really, could be any incident, but we're focused on use of force here. So the answer is, I don't know. I don't have an answer about, here's the best policy for everybody. You should do this. I'm not going to be able to tell you that today. because we all work in different jurisdictions, different agencies, different political pressures, unfortunately, comes into this, and I think it shouldn't, but the fact of life is that it does. So here's a couple of them. Officers, these are just examples of policies and even state laws. Officers have to provide an initial statement before they can view video, audio, or any of that stuff. These policies are all over the place, even in the same state. I've got one here, Oakland PD and San Francisco PD, where I used to work. I was an officer there in San Francisco with the U.S. Park Police. You can throw a rock across the bay, and they're both big cities, both got quite a bit of crime, vastly different policies on this video issue. Another one, officers may, but aren't required to watch the video before making a statement. And one policy says they should review it, but it's not mandatory. It's up to the officer. And I think I'd probably want to see it. Human beings, I'd like to see what did I do? I remember this, but what's the camera show? So some policies give the officer the option. And then after they've watched it once, maybe, or give their statement, watch it, and then do a supplement if that jogs their memory, or if they see something in the video that makes them realize, oh, that's not what really happened, now that I think about it. And then some say that the officers cannot review the body-worn camera. That's Oakland. That's their policy before making a full report. And then some cases have it where, like in Georgia usually, and it's not the law, it's just the practice. If somebody from another agency is investigating your use of force in your department, some policies say that they get to decide. And some say they can ask, but the person doesn't have to talk to them, depending on their agency's policies. So they're all over the place. And here's what they say, reasons that we should allow the viewing. Because we want to find out what happened. We're on a search for the truth, right? The whole point of a criminal investigation or an internal affairs investigation or any of these things that we do, we want to find out what really happened. Well, if you view the video camera, well, clearly the camera caught what really happened, right? Maybe not. But these are reasons that folks give for having to watch the video first. And here's a big one. We use it in other cases. Why should use of force be different? I know when I was on the road, I did a lot of DUIs, I was a traffic guy, I did lots of traffic stops, and when I did DUIs, we had the little notebook. Which step did they skip in SFSTs? And I had to write all that stuff down in my little notebook. Now, we train officers, and they say, well, no, I watch my body cam footage. And you're not busy doing this, right? It's a safety issue as well. You're watching a guy, you can tell if they failed or not. But when you're doing the report, you go back and play the video, make sure you didn't get the wrong step or they put their foot down on the wrong count. So why not use of force? Why is it special? They say it can reduce inconsistencies at trial to show, no, you said this in your report, and the video says this. Why are you lying? That kind of cross-examination question. And hopefully folks like Lance can knock that down when it happens in the courtroom. But it's a concern. We can explain why those happen, just what we're talking about here. The human body doesn't perceive things as they might appear on a video. And then state laws, well, actually, we've done this. I just mentioned it. You interview 4 people, and it all lines up perfectly. Red flag, right? Not everybody sees everything the same. And then some state laws require it to take place. And I got a couple of examples there. Here's Texas. That's their occupation code. They require agencies to have policies that guarantee an officer's access to these videos before they make a statement of any kind or before they're interviewed. And they got a model policy. That's what they say. I'm not going to read it to you. But the bottom one is important. They shall be given access to any recording. It means they don't have to do it, but you've got to let them have the choice before you interview them in Texas. That's a state law. It's not a state policy, but the policy has to include that ability for the officer. But, that seems pretty clear, right? It's not a bad policy, but then this came up. And I just found this a couple weeks ago when I was researching some stuff for this presentation. Do we allow the officer to look at just his or her body camera? Or do we let him watch every body camera or every security camera or the dash cam of 4 cars who were there and seeing it from different angles? There's pros and cons to that too. But the Dallas district attorney was faced with this issue, trying to follow the state law, and it came up in an investigation. Okay, the law says, the policy says I can watch my personal camera or my video, but how about my partners over here, 10 feet on this side, or my other partner who was coming around the building on this side and saw it at a completely different angle? So they asked the Attorney General for an opinion back, it was only September 8th, so a little bit over a month and a half ago. And they said, we've got a dilemma because we've got uninvolved officers who recording things that the officer who used the force could not have seen. So how does watching that video help him remember or her remember what happened? And the argument is it doesn't. And then also we've got the involved officer. So you've got these folks watching the officer use force. They're seeing that video before they make their report, and vice versa. The officer involved is looking at other video that they couldn't have perceived when they were there. So there's not an answer yet. And the, excuse me, the DA is concerned about embellishment. That juries will think that they're adding to their story or changing it. It's just, I think it's partly a trial strategy. And they say they don't let other witnesses talk to witnesses prior to being interviewed. Why would we let an officer look at somebody else's tape before they're interviewed? And I see that point. And then they're worried that might hurt the officer's credibility. Florida just had one that took place, 4 months ago. They may view their own camera footage before they're being interviewed. And then the third one, that I'm sure there's probably more. I just stopped at 3 when I was doing the research on this. Florida created this, Connecticut created a mandatory model policy that all the agencies in Connecticut have to follow. And this is a little bit different. I had to read it twice before I noticed what it is. If you're involved in use of force or you're subject of disciplinary proceedings, you shall have the right to look at your footage with your attorney or your union rep present. That's not unusual. But it also says they shall have the right to look at any other video or audio that captures him or her. So anybody else's body camera, any security camera that videotaped that officer when they were doing what they were doing, they're allowed to see that before they talk. And any audio recording that captures their voice, the same right applies. So that's gone far beyond the other 2 state laws. And here's reasons that people say not to let them watch it. Because Graham tells us what? No 20/20 hindsight. And the argument is that looking at video is 20/20 hindsight. That's what folks who oppose this say. And they're afraid of influencing the officer's memory. I talked about that briefly, that things you see afterwards can pollute or contaminate the true memory of what happened. That's been shown it can happen from time to time. And there's kind of a compromise out there. We'll see a couple of policies that have this, where they let them see it, let them make the statement first, watch the video, and then add a supplement to it. And it's kind of a compromise. And the issue also is, I've heard this before. It's happened in the Tulsa shooting, I think. What's the public going to think? What's the jury going to think if I get to watch the video before I make a statement? Because we don't let other suspects watch bank robbery footage before they come and make a statement to the FBI. That doesn't happen. Why are cops special? That's the argument. And I don't agree with that personally, but that's what folks will say. And it could affect credibility. That's the main concern. I looked at this, the ACLU's policy. Here's, not surprisingly, they think that officers should not view it first. But their policy on cameras goes, it's very broad. They say if you enter a person's home, you need to have permission before you can record. And I can see how that works in a domestic violence situation. You're going to go in and, hey, can I please record you as I do my job? That's, to me, a little unrealistic. And here's the hybrid policy. You can't look at anything until you submit the report, and then you get to talk to internal affairs, and afterwards, after it's all finished, you can write your report or add to it if you need to, or change something you put in the first place. And I think this could be effective only if we tell the officers, and it's very clear to everybody involved, that you're not changing your story. If you see something in the video that jogs your memory, don't feel bad about admitting it, because it's normal. We might see things, hear things that, oh yeah, I forgot about that, and then you write it down. And warning them not to put something down that you don't really remember. So I think that's important if we're going to use this approach, to let the officers know exactly what we're looking for, what happened from their perspective. And here are the 2 I mentioned earlier. Here's Oakland's general order out in California. You can't watch, their officers cannot watch the video before completing their report and the interview. And that's not just submitting it, it's got to be approved by the supervisor first before they can watch any video. And once the video, the report is approved, and the interview is all finished, the policy states that the investigator will show the officer any tape that exists, any audio, video recordings. They will. Now, I'm not sure how they can make the officer sit there and do that. I guess they can, but it says shall. And then after that, they're given an opportunity to add to it. So that's probably not a very unusual policy. There's probably several like that. And here's what I told you across the bay is different. This is San Francisco PD's. Caused quite a bit of controversy locally. This is last year. And it's different in a way because following a shooting, and I think it's shooting, an in custody death, or any kind of criminal investigation involving that officer. The officer has to provide an initial statement before they watch a video. And that's defined as summarizing what happened, basically. It could be a paragraph. And then, if they choose to, they can watch the video, hear the audio, and then supplement it afterwards. And people were up in arms, certain members of the community were up in arms about the initial statement part. And that's also another way to compromise it. You put the bare bones, kind of give us an idea of what happened so we can start investigating it, watch the video, and then give us a detailed account of what happened. So with that, that's all I have. Mr. Miller's going to take over with some of his things he has to say. Tim?
Well, thank you. Warning police officers not to watch video prior to is based on a premise that they are judged by the facts that are known to them at the time. Proponents of a known to standard, meaning that you got to know it to make it relevant, fear that if the officer watches the video first, the officer will shape that statement around the video instead of what the officer actually knows. But I think if there's room to question the premise, I think there's also room to question the warning. And a premise or a legal standard that tells police officers that they have to know the facts under circumstances when it's very likely that they will not just doesn't really make sense to me. Stress affects perception. That's a given. Auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, they're common symptoms of high stress that might prevent a police officer from seeing or hearing what is occurring right in front of them. Auditory exclusion. One police officer stated that if it hadn't been for the recoil of my pistol, I wouldn't have known my gun was working. Now put that into perspective. A police officer's just discharged a weapon within inches of his face, and he didn't hear it. Dr. Lewinsky from the Force Science Institute, he put tunnel vision into perspective by comparing the camera lens to the human eye. The camera lens is kind of like the movie, the big picture at the movie. Under stress, that police officer is only going to be able to see what you could see through maybe a paper towel tube, or like Brad said, what you can see on the tip of your thumb. And then, of course, comes the invisible gorilla. A book about inattention blindness. Subjects of a study up at Harvard were asked to watch a videotape of two teams passing basketballs. They were told to keep their eye on the team wearing the white jerseys. Count the number of passes of the basketball made by the team wearing the white jerseys. About halfway through the middle of the video, a woman wearing a full-body gorilla suit walks into the middle of the court, beats its chest, and then walks out. About half of the subjects don't remember seeing the gorilla, hence the title of the book. Their attention was directed elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, totally unencumbered by stress or body cameras, these unemotional witnesses at the scene may very well record facts that the officer did not see or hear due to these natural symptoms of high stress, auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, inattention blindness. But are they relevant? While the science supports the conclusion that something may occur right in front of us that we didn't see and be recorded on our body cameras, the lawyers can't always agree when it's relevant. The presumption appears to be that objectively reasonable force is based upon the officer's perspective. You ask what the officer knew at the time. If the officer didn't know it at the time, it's not relevant. It doesn't matter if it was recorded on the officer's body camera. That was really the national consensus policy endorsed that known to standard in January of this year when it stated that objectively reasonable force is based upon the officer's evaluation of the facts in light of the facts known to the officer and upon what an objectively reasonable officer would do under the same or similar circumstances. I think I got that. I had to read it a couple of times, but I think what that really means is it's a subjective standard, meaning that it's not totally objective. Subjective, meaning the first question is really, what did the officer know? Did he suffer from auditory exclusion? Did he fall within that percentage, that 80%? What was he tunneled in on? What was his attention directed on? Once you know the facts that the officer knew, then you run them through or run them by the lens of this hypothetical officer. Could a reasonable officer believe that the force was reasonable based upon what the officer knew? Kind of a tongue tire. Legal standards are made by ladies and gentlemen, men and women up on the bench, and like all legal standards, like anything, men and women, they've got good points and bad points. The virtue of a standard that judges police officers based upon what they know at the time, a subjective standard, so to speak, is that it roots out subjectively bad decisions. Think about that. It does. It's attempting to root out a subjectively bad decision. Proponents of a known to standard would tell you, police officers shouldn't go around shooting people unless they know the facts that make that shooting reasonable at the time. But the downside is consistency. Two police officers could very well be in that same situation. They could face those same facts. They could use the same force, and one could be liable for excessive force and the other not, depending on their subjective memory. Well, what did the Supreme Court really say in Graham versus Connor? You can compare the language, in Graham, compare the language in Graham to what the National Consensus Policy says. Graham starts out with Tennessee versus Garner, and you know what Garner said. Garner said, you look at the totality of the facts and circumstances. You don't ask what the officer knew. You look at the totality of the facts and circumstances. The only caveat on relevance, the only caveat on what can be considered is in a sentence that uses a reasonable officer standard. Objectively reasonable force must be from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene and without the vision of 20/20 hindsight. I think what Graham is saying is that you substitute the objectively reasonable officer for the real one and ask that objectively reasonable officer, what could have been seen, what could have been heard, what was knowable. And of course, something recorded on the officer's body camera, I think it would be knowable. It may not be known to the officer, but it would at least be knowable. Graham really steers away from subjective decisions, where you've got different decisions, different outcomes, based upon the same objectively manifested facts. Graham asks, for the facts that were confronting the officer. It doesn't say anything about what the officer actually knew. This reasonable officer, ladies and gentlemen, of course, who is that? Who you keep talking about? The reasonable officer is obviously the court, looking at everything through this hypothetical lens. The officer can obviously add to the facts. That officer may have some facts to add that body camera didn't pick up. His body camera, however, that witness at the stand can also add facts. Witnesses might have something to say. The plaintiff may have something to say. And of course, those use of force experts can also help the jury weigh the evidence. Something may be knowable, but there may be a good reason why the officer didn't know it at the time. Knowable just means deserving consideration. It can be added to the totality of all the other facts and circumstances that go to the ultimate conclusion as to whether or not the force was objectively reasonable at the time. The temptation may be to say that, well, it was knowable that Marquise Hudspeth had only a cell phone, pointing a cell phone at police officers, and that shooting him was not reasonable at the time. But that ignores the totality of the facts and circumstances. Marquise, if you know the story, Mr. Hudspeth led the police officers on a high-speed vehicle pursuit. He stopped at a convenience store. He got out, began to run from the police officers. He then grabbed his cell phone and using a two-handed shooting stance, pretty much like this, he pointed it at those police officers. And you can see the police officers ducking in fear of being shot. Pause the video, look at that video really closely, and you can say, hey, you know, that's not a gun. But again, pausing the video is just another fact to consider. You know, the police officers did not have that luxury at the time. We could file all of this, ladies and gentlemen, under who cares if it was not for body cameras. But body cameras, they're going to pick up facts that were not known to the officer at the time. It's a given. Whether or not they're relevant or not, however, is going to depend upon the standard used. Under a known to standard, they're not. If the officer didn't know it at the time, it's not relevant. Doesn't matter whether or not it was recorded on the officer's body cameras. That's why proponents of a known to standard admonish law enforcement agencies not to allow police officers to watch their video because they're fearing that the officer will shape that testimony around the video rather than what he actually knew at the time. What the known to standard really does, ladies and gentlemen, is it tells the police officers that they got to know the facts in a situation where it's very likely that they will not know them. It also creates a dilemma for that police officer when he doesn't know the facts. You know, this is a police officer that's facing civil liability. His career is on the line, college kid funds. You know, does he tell the court that he saw the gorilla when in fact he did not? I mean, it's a huge burden to put on a police officer, and one that it's just kind of hard for me to imagine that the Supreme Court wanted to create. I think it's much more likely that the Supreme Court, what it intended to do was to create a reasonable officer standard. Again, you substitute the reasonable officer for the real one and ask what was knowable at the time. Known to or knowable, I want to go through this scenario just for a second with you. This is a scenario I went through at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And I want you to think about how a known to standard can not only dictate, you know, pretrial preparation when we look at that video, but also the outcome of this case. My scenario, it was officer down. This scenario came on, dispatch came on. There's an officer down at the corner of 5th and Main. And I'm seeing what's happening. I arrive on scene and a crowd of people run by me. They're shouting, they're screaming. I don't remember what they were saying. I proceeded on down to the end of the alley, and down at the end of the alley, I see a man laying down on the ground, which I assume is the officer down, and a man standing over him. And that man standing over him has a gun. He's screaming at me. He's yelling at me. He's got a gun. It's an automatic pistol, something like a Model 1911, something that you would see in a World War II movie. I don't know what I said. I said, police, drop it, put the gun down. I don't know what I said. He didn't put the gun down. Instead, he continued to wave the gun around, pointed at me, pointed the guy on the ground, and, you know, I shot him. All right. I was debriefed, much like we would debrief a student at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I was asked to paint that picture. What happened? Well, I tried to start painting that picture. I told the instructor that, you know, that there was an officer down. I arrived on scene. A crowd of people ran by me. Only briefly described the crowd of people, and he stopped me. And he said, well, what did the crowd of people say? What did they tell you? And I said, I don't know. I just gibberish, screaming, yelling. And he said, you didn't hear the woman in the crowd say he's got a gun? And I said, no. And then, much like video, just like that video, he replayed the scenario. And this time I heard the woman in the crowd yell, he's got a gun. That was not known to me. I didn't know it. And to this day, I cannot remember anyone saying anything about a pistol, about anyone having a gun. I got frustrated. You know, this was auditory exclusion in my mind. Police officers, soldiers, Marines, they experience auditory exclusion in gunfights. Tim Miller experienced auditory exclusion in a training scenario at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I began to argue with the instructor. Doesn't matter, you know, so what if she said I didn't hear she had a gun? So what? The guy had a gun. The guy had a gun, and I told him to drop it. He pointed at me, he didn't, and so I shot him. I even quoted the 11th Circuit, stating that I didn't have to wait for the gun to be pointed at me. And I could tell I was kind of going down the primrose path by the way the instructor looked at me. He said, okay, well, what kind of gun was it? And I said, it was a model 1911, an automatic pistol. I even saw the slide on it. And then he replayed the video, much like you replay body camera footage. And this time it wasn't a gun, it was actually a hammer that I saw. Now, this is my point. Everybody at the federal law enforcement, we were experimenting with these new simulators, and I was probably 20 people that day went through that same scenario. Every one of those people went through the same scenario that I did. Everyone saw the same facts. I think if I put that scenario up here, everyone in this room would say, okay, shooting that guy probably fell within the range of objective reasonableness. But the point that I'm trying to make is that my evaluation of the system, I'm quoting my evaluation of that situation based upon the facts I knew at the time wasn't quite as good as somebody that heard the warning. Somebody that heard the warning could more reasonably believe that the man had a gun, all right, or possessed a gun, and posed maybe a more significant threat. And you're probably thinking, well, not to the guy on the ground that just had his head caved in with a hammer, But continue on down memory lane for a little bit. What if I had not only tuned out the woman in the crowd, but I had tunneled in so tightly on the man's face that I didn't see anything at all in his hands? That's a problem under a known to standard. Under a known to standard, what am I left with? I'm left with officer down. I'm left with a crowd of people that ran by me, shouting, screaming something. I've got a man screaming over a police officer, all right? But that's all I've got. Ladies and gentlemen, I would not be so quick to say that shooting another human being if those were the facts, I would not be so quick to say that that's an objective or reasonable use of force. The problem with the known to standard is that two officers, again, could be in the same situation. They can face the same objectively manifested facts, but one officer could be liable and the other not, depending, again, upon their subjective memory. There's also the plaintiff to think about in this controversy. There's the other side, and whether or not it's really objectively reasonable to consider the facts from the perspective of the officer, based on what the officer knew. There is another side to this controversy. What if the woman in the crowd had yelled something suggesting that the man was not a threat? What if she had yelled, the man's having a heart attack, referring to the officer down? That kind of paints that guy in a different light. What's he yelling? What's he screaming for? Is he yelling for help? I think those are pretty tough questions under a no-to standard, and I have trouble answering them. They are tough issues, tough questions under a known-to standard. I think Graham, on the other hand, kind of makes those questions go away. Under Graham, again, you look at the facts from the perspective of a reasonable officer in the shoes of the real one, and you ask what could have been known. Sometimes the officer gets a windfall. I would have got a windfall. The woman's warning about a gun could be considered in my defense because, a reasonable officer could have heard it. Nonetheless, if the woman had said something suggesting that the man was not a threat, that too would go in, that would inure to the plaintiff's benefit. The reasonable officer standard, in my opinion, kind of adds consistency to this. It adds consistency. I think the fact-finding process, it should be as objective as the ultimate conclusion itself. The sub-objective standard that I referred to earlier, remember that? Sub-objective, first you ask the officer and then you run those facts through the reasonable officer. The subjective standard is really a misnomer, I think. If the facts that go into making a decision are subjectively selected by the officer, how can the ultimate outcome not be also subjective? A known to standard, in my opinion, what a known to standard does is it tells the police officer he's got to know the facts in a situation where it's really unlikely that the officer will know them or be able to recall them accurately. The reasonable officer standard kind of remedies that. It also, the known to standard creates that moral dilemma for the officer. When he doesn't know the facts, when he doesn't see the gorilla, what does he tell the court? Does he tell the court that he saw it when he didn't? Graham tells the court to make allowances. You've heard this, you've read this. I know that many of you probably read this before. You've read this out of the Graham. Graham tells the lower court to make allowances for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second decisions in situations that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary. Well, I think the Supreme Court would probably say, in my opinion, I think the Supreme Court is saying you ought to make allowances for the fact that, the officer doesn't see or hear something due to a normal symptom of high stress. I felt, in my scenario, I felt cheated, really. I really felt cheated when I didn't hear that something as significant as he has a gun, something as significant as that couldn't be used in my legal defense because of a natural symptom of high stress, like auditory exclusion. I just don't think the court envisioned that. So when should the officer look at the video? Supreme Court hasn't really stated. In my opinion, the Supreme Court has not made a definitive ruling as to whether it's a known to standard, a knowable standard, or something different, which kind of leaves this question open. When should the officer look at the video? It really only makes sense not to look at the video if it's a known to standard. Under an objectively reasonable officer standard, I think that it really shouldn't make any difference. The pressure, you understand what I'm saying? If it's an objectively reasonable officer, the pressure shouldn't exist. The officer would likely be given a pre-advisement before watching the video and told, you may not know all the facts, but what you know is not dispositive. What you know is not dispositive. Your perspective is not what's important. It's that reasonable officer standard. You're just adding to the facts. You're adding to the totality of all the other facts and circumstances that go into the ultimate conclusion as to whether or not the force was objectively reasonable. I think if the officers had that pre-advisement, they would probably, really be more inclined to be very truthful about just what they did see. But I don't know the answer. I don't really. Like I said, the court has not ruled definitively, and I tell you, in a situation like that where we don't have, I would leave it up to the litigants. I would leave it up to the officer as to whether or not that officer wanted to watch the video first or not. After all, the suit is against him. The civil suit is against him as individual capacity. Let him make his own decisions. Thank you.
All right, we're going to gear up the presentation here. And I get to follow up with the pragmatic and the who wanted to hear a lawyer at 8 o'clock in the morning.
3.
The answer is nobody. All right, so I kind of subtitled this, and we want to get through this so we make sure we have plenty of time for questions, to see or not to see. So basically what I do, I'm the guy that follows up afterwards. I have an officer who's heaving in the corner and praying, some of them in the fetal position, some of them who have been in combat before, who cannot believe they're having an emotional reaction to having stopped a heartbeat when they've stopped hundreds of them before. But what they've realized is what I wrote about in When Cops Kill, officers who get involved in shootings go from zero stress to maximum stress in a microsecond. I interviewed an officer in that book who was a special forces operator and said it was far more stressful to be involved in a shooting on the street than it was to be in a hot area as a special forces soldier. And I took that to heart. I think one of the things we have to look at today is what's at risk after a shooting. So this is an ABC News poll from July 10, 2016. Police face shortages in recruiting, 90% in some places where it's down. I'm not telling anybody anything y'all have not seen. A lot of people are dealing with shortages and people wanting to be law enforcement. I've done about 500 media interviews. I actually teach a class, 4-hour and 8-hour class on officer-involved shootings, and also a class on media response, 4-hour or 8-hour or whatever will fit with y'all. But I recently told a reporter, they were talking about how terrible these cops are and how they're using force and not shooting to wound and they're lying. And I said, well, if you don't like them, you're going to hate the second string. And they said, what's the second string? I said, that's all the cops that get out of this business because they're tired of listening to you, and they start hiring all the people that can't pass a background check right now. I don't have a chain of command. It's wonderful. But this is one of the biggest things we're dealing with. We have officers retiring as soon as they can. We have recruit pools dropping. We have recruit skills that are concerning. We have people that are in police academies. Anybody here teach defensive tactics? We have people in recruit schools whose only confrontation they've ever had is somebody sending them a text in all capital letters, and they were upset about it for 3 days. You know, we also have fewer law enforcement families. I know a lot of agencies that rely on those legacy recruits when they're senior persons retiring. On the way out the door, they're saying, I told my kid never to be a law enforcement officer. So this is basically what we're looking at. 2017 to date, we have 107 officers killed, 39 by gunfire, 3 by vehicular assault, and we're in the last quarter. And I don't know if anybody saw that class yesterday on ambushes, but in 2016, almost 1/3 of the officers who were shot and killed were killed in ambushes. So here's the issue that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the real-time effect of statements and agency silence. Agency silence is done. If you have an agency policy where you don't talk after an officer's involved in a shooting, fix it. You cannot afford to be silent anymore. Darren Wilson did not shoot anybody in the back. Darren Wilson did not shoot anybody with their hands in surrender position. Darren Wilson was cleared by a police department, a grand jury, and a DA's office, the United States Department of Justice, that was run by an attorney general who really didn't like police officers. And he is completely unemployable in law enforcement right now. And we have officers being shot, killed, and ambushed because of the nonsense that went out after that. But this is a statement in Minneapolis. This is the mayor. We all want to know what happened. I want to know more. I call on the BCA to share as much as they can as quickly as they can. Basically, she was asking the officer to waive his Fifth Amendment right to privilege and speak to the investigators so she could address the media better. And this is a pattern. I just submitted an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal about this. We have this pattern after a shooting. We have the officer-involved shooting, and then we have speculation, reckless comments, and witnesses speak. I won't do air quotes because I hate them, but that's exactly what they are. Nobody ever vets these people to see if they were even in the same city when they said that they saw something. We have media attention, which is nonstop. The investigation's finished, the officer's cleared, and then people don't want to utter those horrible words that are excruciating as giving up your left kidney. I was wrong. They're scared to death to say they were wrong, so then they say the system's biased. And that's what we're dealing with right now. That is exactly what we're dealing with. People criticizing a system because they don't understand it, and they'd rather, run their mouths than absolutely understand what's going on. During the last election, there were 5 bombs that went off in New York City and New Jersey in about a 3 or 4 day period. Can anybody think of a reason for a bomb to go off in a city other than terrorism? Just loud noises people want to hear? I still haven't figured it out. But everybody said, well, we're not going to jump to conclusions and say that's terrorism. Yet an officer will shoot somebody across the country, and a politician will say that it was racially motivated. So here's the thing. When you have an officer-involved shooting, you have 2 choices. You can have quick answers, or you can have a thorough investigation. You can't have both. That's the end of it. You can't have both. And that's what people need to be telling the media. That's what they need to be telling the courts. That's what they need to be telling the stakeholders. I don't like citizen review panels. I think they're stupid. I think that if people want to have those, I think we ought to have a bunch of street cops with high school educations doing reviews of forensic accountants who look at the city and county's books every year. It's about as effective. In the city of Atlanta, we had an officer who was cleared of a shooting, but the Citizen Review Board recommended discipline because he told the person to drop the whatever expletive gun. I'm sure he would have made him a ham sandwich if he could have gotten to drop the gun that way, but he's probably out of bread. But this is what's at risk. When we take these statements, we're not looking at them in a vacuum. We're looking at the effect of this officer, and I'm the guy that responds out to the scene. I've seen reactions from officers that you would not believe after a shooting. Very predictable and some completely unpredictable. If you haven't seen this chart, those are line of duty deaths. Those are police suicides. These are your people. This is not an academic discussion. This is not a discussion of statistics. This is a discussion about real people following a shooting, or officers who have had to flee the state, not the city, the state, after the media attention. So as you can tell, I'm an unapologetic advocate for officers. I've dealt with false claims against officers, officers shot in the line of duty, fatal shooting at a police academy. I've done a lot of work dealing with critical incident response, and I've started doing some expert witness work just for one reason, because I'm just tired of people appearing as expert witnesses who don't have a clue as to what they're doing. And I'll talk about the books that I wrote in a second. Every attorney should have a disclaimer. There's mine. I'm licensed in Georgia and Arkansas, but I will tell you, just as an example of this, because people are going to ask about these when we have our panel discussion, I want to make sure I answer this. You can go around the United States and look at the enabling statute that tells officers they could use deadly force. Now, I'm a pretty simple guy. I like model policies, but I think policies on use of force should say our officers are authorized to use deadly force and any other force up to the limits of the Fourth Amendment and our state law. Be real simple. You wouldn't have to have 25-page policies, and it would keep you from getting sued 99% of the time. But we don't do that. But if you look at those enabling statutes, what do they say? What's the standard on an officer using force? A reasonable belief. A reasonable belief. A probable cause standard is a reasonable belief. And what do we know about probable cause? You can be 100% wrong and still have a defendable case. It's the same thing. You shoot somebody with a cell phone in their hands, you can still be 100% in a defendable situation if your reasonable belief told you they were a deadly threat. And we talk about cameras. Cameras are not new. I'm doing a second edition of the first book I wrote, When Cops Kill. The first camera, it's actually kind of funny looking. I don't have permission to use the picture yet, but it's a 1939 patrol car with a motion picture camera mounted on the dashboard. Can anybody tell why they probably stopped using those? Somebody with a pocket protector and a Band-Aid around their glasses said they were probably too expensive. But this is the caption on the picture. There's no arguing with the testimony from this camera. Interesting word, testimony. It's not testimony, it's footage. That's all it is. When you see an action picture movie, do you really think Arnold Schwarzenegger takes a round to the shoulder? They do all sorts of things with footage. And footage, anybody here shoot sporting clays? If you ever want to absolutely, maybe it's more frustrating than golf. You're safer with me with a shotgun in my hand than a golf club. I could kill somebody with a golf club, okay? But sporting clays are like skeet, but we change the background. We change the topography. And I could get you to believe that a clay pigeon that's going straight out away from you is dropping at 2 or 3 feet per second. Cameras change perspective. So let's look at a video real quick. I know the screens, if we can drop the lights a little bit on that, I think it'll help. But this is a dash cam video. And this is par for the course for what we have, because the camera isn't where we need it.
Get in the car. Don't get out the car. Get in the car. Where's wrong shoes? Where's wrong shoes? Get on the ground. Right,
How many of y'all wanted to move the camera over about 14 times? Welcome to video. So there's 3 current positions right now on officers watching videos without a law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. There's about 11 states that have those, and they're just completely different critters in the woods because there's statutory rights about seeing them. The first one is the no, never, they'll lie, they'll twist the facts, and they'll all lie anyway. If you belong in that group, please go back to your department and resign. We got enough people outside the profession trying to kill us. We don't need you helping. Second one is allow the officer full access prior to making any statements. And the third one is a hybrid that I think a lot of people are adopting. I've pushed a lot of people to adopt with a caveat. Allow the law enforcement officer to make a statement, then view the video if they wish, then follow up with more information if they wish. But if you have people that are making statements to criminal investigators or to your internal affairs without the benefit of a lawyer helping them sort out what they're saying, you're out of your mind. I have seen officers with a great deal of seasoning, a great deal of gray on their heads that could barely talk. They were tired, they were exhausted, they were mentally spent, and they had no idea how they were going to react. And people always talk about shooting bad guys. When I don't talk to, I teach about 2,000 officers a year from the United States, Canada, and a couple of other countries. I don't get to teach recruits very often, but I tell them something. I say, how many of y'all have thought you might have to shoot somebody? Nobody raise their hand. How many of you ever thought it might be a woman? All of a sudden, there's this like quiet. How many of y'all thought it might be a 15-year-old gangbanger? And now it's not fun anymore. What do we do to that officer's moral compass? What do we do to that officer's pride in their work when they kill a 15-year-old gangbanger? And they go up there and they take the gun out of their hand and they handcuff somebody and their wrists are so small they won't even fit in the handcuffs. You're going to let that person speak without the benefit of counsel? So the officers as presumptive liars, it's not grounded in reality. These groups hate law enforcement. They're political hacks. They don't understand the use of force. They don't understand statements. They're part of an anti-law enforcement officer movement. It's amazing. It's supported by any law enforcement organization. It's insulting. And let me tell you something else. I finished a book on media response. I've done over 500 interviews. Let me help you so far as your policies and your procedures and what you're telling them. If they belong to this group, they hate you. They're not going to change that. They're not going to like you because you change your policy to make them happy. They will find another reason to hate you. So what did the officer see?
He's got his hands up there for her now. Mike, I'm going to hit the recorder. This guy's still walking and following commands.
Not for taser, I think.
Got a feeling that's about to happen.
That looks like a bad dude, too. To be honest with you.
Which way are they facing?
Police 1, they're facing westbound. I think he may have just been tasered.
Shots fired!
Betty Shelby had to leave the state because people were threatening to kill her. Her criminal defense cost $411,000. It was paid for by the FOP legal defense plan. But that's what she was facing. So I did a couple of interviews and people said, well, we could see what happened. I said, you have absolutely no idea what happened. Graham says, what did the officer see? What did the officer reasonably perceive? And you're going to indict this officer on a helicopter that's flying 500 or 600 feet off the ground. That video is completely irrelevant to the analysis. But we've always got people who will say they saw something. You've got to get this video from people. You've got to coordinate. And should the officer be allowed to have access to that? I think at the very least you need to look at the officer and say, hey, there is a person who says they saw you do X. Enough for the officer to say, no, that never happened. Should the officer be able to see any available video? I think in the states that have Peace Officers' Bill of Rights, a lot of them are. But there's a question to find the video that gives the officer's perspective as much as possible. And I'm going to show you in a minute that it's probably not the body camera. But you can expect videos to surface everywhere. They'll be on the news at the criminal trial. They'll be at the civil suit. They'll be poor quality, bad sound, and bad angle. I have recruits all the time that get complaining about people carrying cell phones and videotaping them. I said, you should want them to have 2 cell phones because, at least, there's no gun in the hand that has a cell phone. That would make me really happy. But here's the Ferguson question. Anybody know what the population of Ferguson is? 21,000 people. That's all. 21,000 people. You have a sunny Saturday in a very, very populated area within the city. People were shown to have a distrust of police. Does anybody here really believe that the encounter with Michael Brown and Darren Wilson was not videotaped? I don't believe it. I think as soon as that patrol car pulled in that neighborhood, people were videotaping it. But you'll probably never see those videos. I was on CNN about 3 days after it happened asking about that. So here's the considerations of the officer actually viewing the video. Force Science did a study in England with armed police, and they had monitors hooked up to the officer to monitor their physiology and their responses to a very, very tense situation, several tense situations. Then they had the officers do a feedback session where they watched the video. Their physiological responses while watching the video were almost the same as when they're perceiving the event. Now, those of y'all that have seen this, you have to be careful, because I like either the officer seeing it to start with or that hybrid approach, where they make an initial statement, they see it, and then they supplement it. But after you show that officer that video, you may have an officer curled up in the fetal position who's incapable of speaking. And you have to be prepared for that. There's also generational differences. Older officers have been trained and grown accustomed to the presence of video. And then you have younger officers who see videos as part of their daily lives. You know, we were talking about those ambushes yesterday, and they talk about training officers to get out of the passenger door. You're going to have to go 3 rounds with the MDT before you get out of there. You're never getting out of the passenger door of a normal patrol car anymore. But imagine these younger officers under 30. Imagine somebody who's never been in a car without an MDT. They've never investigated a case without a video available. They've never investigated a case without the internet. It's a different world. And when these people do statements, they go back and watch them. They go to the domestic dispute. They work that domestic, and then they sit there and they go, what did that guy tell me? Did he say she used a right hand or a left hand? What did the woman tell me about what time that guy got back? So they go and watch the videos, and they've gotten used to it. They've gotten used to watching those videos, and we want them to. We want them to have the most accurate statements possible. Every stakeholder in the criminal justice system wants accurate statements. Complaints with body cameras are nearly eliminated or reduced because of it. And then we're going to have an officer write the most important statement of their life, where their very freedom could be at issue, where their liability and the liability of the agency could be at issue. And we're saying, no, you can't watch the video. It doesn't make any sense. Telling the officer they absolutely cannot watch the video makes absolutely no sense. Because people forget something, especially in a criminal context. The officer's justification, which is a reason why their actions were not unlawful, must come from the officer. It's an affirmative defense under criminal law. It must come from the officer, whether that's a punch, a kick, or a shot. That officer has to be able to state what that is. They've got to be able to speak to those criminal investigators, and you want them to have as much information available when they give the most important statement of their lives. Their reasonable beliefs are important. I've spoken to prosecutors before, and I tell them it doesn't matter to me whether the person has a gun or not, whether they're armed or not. It's not a relevant part of the analysis. And they look like my basset hound used to when she didn't understand stuff. What matters is whether the officer reasonably believed the person was armed, whether they reasonably believed the person was a threat and what type of threat they were. And when the officer's statement is given, the officer needs to put the suspect's actions in terms of criminal law, not the person came at me and didn't stop. The person was possessing a firearm. I was an officer in uniform, wearing our Class A uniform. I ordered him to drop the weapon. He started to raise the weapon, thereby committing an aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer. I used deadly force to stop a forcible felony. What is wrong with having that as a statement? Whatever statement the officer gives, you're stuck with that statement for years, through the grand juries, through the civil case, through the media. You want those statements to be as complete as possible. That's why I like the hybrid model, but I definitely say the officer should have access to the video if they want it. So here's a video that will definitely fill you in on exactly what happened. Everybody clear? I got no clue what happened. The only way you're going to find out what happened is from that officer. And if we ever get to a point where people say if the officer's statement doesn't match the video, then the officer's lying, we've lost. And it's not true. If you even believe that's the case, you're hiring the wrong people. Body cameras will never give you the officer's perspective or point of view. They have no peripheral vision. They see differently in low light and no light. They don't focus on threats. Officers are constantly focusing on threats. If I stand here and put my hands in my pockets, nobody here is nervous. If I do that at 2:30 in the morning on a traffic stop, I've got a problem and so do you. It's situational dependent. Body cameras don't change their focus based on an injury, fear, or fatigue. Physical confrontations dislodge them all over the place. I've got a video in my office right now, and it looks like it's something out of NYPD Blue because the officer's camera came off, and it's just swinging back and forth during a fight. The cameras record too slowly to really understand what the officer's perceiving. I think right now the fastest one is 49 frames per second. Your brain records far faster than that. There's also an issue of predictive video. How many of y'all have heard of that? Predictive video is a scary thing where basically software starts filling in the blanks for what the camera can't see. And the focus of an officer getting out on a hot scene should not be pushing a button. I'm starting to see officers getting jammed up because they didn't turn their camera on when they got out of the car on a hot scene. Pushing a button on a camera is a fine motor dexterity skill. Any firearms instructors in here? What's the first thing that goes when you start getting under stress? Fine motor dexterity. When you're talking about the role of the attorney and what we're doing, this is a quote out of Garrity. Officers are not entitled to a watered-down version of their constitutional rights. There's a lot of things we need to deal with, and I'll tell you, the lawyers will win the battle of seeing the video or not when it comes to the criminal investigation. Because I know a lot of lawyers who say, my client would like to see the video before the voluntary interview. Well, we don't show the videos. Oh. So the voluntary interview might not take place. Do you get what I'm saying yet? I want to see the video or he ain't making a statement. Now, I have a problem with that because the officer's got to be able to get some information out in order for the justification. But one of the things we have to see is is the client even coherent enough to give a statement. We've got to keep the entire statement in mind from the officer's perspective. Officers' rights have to be protected. Evidence has to be collected. And that's another thing that I think body cameras are excellent for, is tracing an officer's path. One shooting that I represented an officer on, they wasted hours searching a kudzu field. If y'all are not familiar with kudzu, it is a weed developed by Satan himself. If it's not hiding everything you're looking for, it also is hiding copperheads. So you got that going for you, which is good. But they searched an entire field until somebody asked the officer, what path did you take? He said, well, I didn't run through that stuff. So the cameras can help. But sometimes we have to delay the statements. There was one chief's proposal proposed to a friend of mine. Well, how about the officer gives a statement if you think it's a good shoot and doesn't give the statement if you don't? So did that sound really good inside your head? Because from out here, it really sounded dumb. You know, is the officer okay? Are they physically okay? Mentally okay? Do they have a support system? Are we dealing with a combat veteran or a college student? And I can tell you some of those combat veterans, as I told you to start with, may not react the same way as you would think they would. So the lawyer's got to have a 360-degree focus on the client. That's why we're trying to make sure their statement is complete. That's why we're trying to make sure their statement is put in terms of criminal law and not emotion, because that is what we expect professional police officers to give a statement like. Thinking 3 years ahead. And if you're having tension with the lawyers that you're dealing with over this issue, go meet with them. But just remember, if it was you that shot someone in the parking lot, how hard would you want a lawyer to advocate for you to make sure you could see the video? When we deal with criminal investigations versus administrative interviews, criminal interviews are voluntary. Like I said, most attorneys will not allow the officer to make a statement without the video. The end result is more important than cooperation. I just sat with an officer in a grand jury 2 weeks ago where a DA in Georgia tried to indict him 4 years after a shooting, the day before the statute of limitations. There's some folks out here who are jamming people up without any reason. But the administrative interviews can be frustrated by the investigator, by the lawyer, and by the officer. The officer can give you a statement and say, you know, I'm doing my best, but if you let me see the video, I could give a more complete statement. You're going to fire him when you won't let him watch the video? Are you going to win that? The goals of the IA demand allowing the officer to see the video. Garrity is not in a vacuum. You have a tremendous ability under Garrity to force people to speak as a government entity when normally you would not be allowed to without reading them Miranda. The purpose of Garrity is not to make people speak so you could jam them up. It's to find out holes in your own training. It's to find out if they were properly trained, if they had the right equipment. Did they make a good decision because they were trained to do so, or did they make a good decision because they just happened to have training previously? You need to go farther than just finding probable cause for a violation under an administrative investigation. And so far as these people using the videos to weed out these people who lie about cops, I don't understand somebody making a statement to Internal Affairs without being under oath. And I don't understand not locking them up for a false statement if they make a false statement. And this is something to think about. You can say, I got a lot of rules. That person who lied to you may be the only witness to your next officer-involved shooting. And you just did nothing to damage their credibility when it clearly should be damaged. This is the kind of stuff we're dealing with, the bias against, this is after Ferguson. I think the first thing that needs to happen, you need to arrest Officer Wilson. He shot and killed a man, shot him multiple times, and he's walking free. No one knows anything about him. No one knows why he did it. We need to have that done, number one. That's a Harvard law professor. Ted Kaczynski was a professor too, but that's fine. I mean, this is nonsense. And then we have the threats from within. Officer gets out of a car, suspect fires a few times, suspect runs into a wood line and the officer shoots. His lieutenant told him you can only use deadly force in response to accurate gunfire. I could actually argue that you'll never get a chance to use deadly force in response to accurate gunfire. And then when you're talking about body cameras, are you interviewing the officer to find out what happened, or are you trying to test their memory against the camera? Because let me help you, they'll fail. The camera never blinks. If you test an officer enough against what's on the video, they'll fail. I had an officer that could not remember whether somebody was wearing shorts or pants. You know why? Because he didn't think the suspect's knees were going to kill him. Never focused on it. Every officer-involved statement needs to include these things, and this is why I say they have to have the video available. Information known to the officer, actions of the officer, actions of the suspect, the crimes that were committed, the reason why deadly force was used, why were the first and last shots fired, what actions did the suspect take after the first and last shots, how did the officer affect the arrest, what injuries did the officer suffer, what injuries did the suspect suffer, what actions were taken to get treatment for the officer, and what actions were taken to get treatment for the suspect. So some final points. I'm going to rush through these last few so we can answer some questions, and I'm going to stick around. Never leave the officer alone. Don't rush the process. No two shootings are alike. I've had officers involved in 2 or 3 shootings, and the second and third one turned them upside down, where the first one, they just went right back about their business. There's nothing more important than the officers and the trauma of an officer-involved shooting. I've interviewed officers 15 and 30 years after a shooting, and one officer, a sniper who shot someone who killed 2 police officers, after 15 years said his goal was one day to go 24 hours without thinking about the man he killed. This is PTSD by any other name. Again, the more thorough we can be in these investigations, the better we can protect the officers. These are actual quotes by supervisors to officers who have been involved in shootings. My wife is upset about leaving. Get a dog. You need to get over it. These people should not be supervisors. If you need resources, there's plenty of them available. I can't talk about officer-involved shootings without talking about some of these resources. We're losing far too many officers to suicide. Some states have a peer counselor privilege. If you don't have one, push forward. If you need information from me, I'll get it to you. Basically allows officers to have privileges under the law if they're a trained peer counselor and an officer speaks to them. They can't be involved in the incident, so we can get all the evidence we need, but it's a shoulder that they can cry on if they have to, but they can also talk to somebody who's been there. I'd urge you to sign up for my blog. I think you'll enjoy it. All the book's profits go to law enforcement charities, so I'm going to take about a second and a half and hawk them. This book was about officer-involved shootings. The book is available at larussolawfirm.com. There's a hot link there. This is about a cop's walk with Christ. All the profits, as I said, go to law enforcement charities called Peacemaking. The last one is about media relations and public safety, and that's at lancelarussobooks.com. All of these are available. Please do a review, especially if you like the book. If you don't like the book, you don't have to tell anybody you read it. You know, talking about final thoughts, there's this statement right now about restorative justice. Recruiting numbers are down, early retirements are up. Maybe agencies need to start thinking about training as opposed to discipline for officers that make mistakes. I think there's a lot of officers, from my perspective, that see a video, see the other side of it, and realize they made a mistake, but they're salvageable. So let's take a few questions. Not all at once. Yes, sir. It's all over.
So how could, I don't see the justification for some, I'm not certainly talking here, because I think you have that hybrid. I don't see the justification for some to say the most critical incident of your life. Don't look at the video that you've been trained to look at for the last 5 years. What is the answer? Get rid of the lawyers.
Not all of them.
Just a few.
You know, I think, quite frankly, the people that I've seen, and like I said, I've done a lot of interviews on this. I had the Associated Press in my office the other day looking at an article on this. The people that are saying if you show the officer a video, they'll lie, they should never see it, almost universally are so anti-police that you think you should be carrying absolutely nothing in a holster and that every use of force you use will be terrible. And if you ask them anything about the standards of use of force, you might as well ask them to explain Einstein's theory of relativity, because they don't have a clue. Yes, sir. I do a class on officer-involved shootings for everything from officers, line officers to command staff. And I do a lot of media training, so they'll kind of understand how to deal with having a camera in their face. And I know there's some training out there, but I can tell you, in my experience, I've seen a lot of people in front of cameras, and they don't have a clue. And the other problem is, whether you're the chief or the sheriff or not, if you hate the media, keep your pie hole out in front of a camera. Because they take the same kinesic interview techniques classes that we do, and they'll spot you in a New York minute.
And I can plug FLETC's programs.
Oh, yeah.
We have a use of force instructor training program that's 2 weeks long. And for state and local folks, it's free training. It's very, very thorough. And we've had investigators to street officers to people who train physical techniques, firearms. So they're all talking the same accurate language about Graham v. Connor and what it means. And we're really pushing for the folks who investigate shootings to go through that course, so they know what questions to ask, and they're not going to judge this officer based on some false standard that is out there everywhere. Just watch the news experts, and they say all kinds of stuff. But it's a great program, and it's free.
You referenced Texas's law. I'm with the San Antonio Police Department. We were very prominent in getting that law passed and where we did it. One of the aspects that we were using, that we were basically telling people, is the body camera to modern police officers. It's the 21st century notepad. If we turned around, if we look at an officer involved in a shooting and he took notes at the scene, would we take that notepad away from him before we took a statement?
That's a great analogy.
And I says, it's the 21st century. These kids, that's how they're using it. They're pulling. They pull a driver's license out, they don't read it, they just take it in front of their camera. Then they go back and get the information later. But the other issue that I'd like you guys to speak to was perjury charges, because we've already seen in Texas where a DA filed a charge against an officer for perjury because the DA felt that the video did not match the statement. And so then now the officer's looking at a legal problem because he didn't review the video versus having that statement. And so that was the other issue that we had. But, you know, those things that we see, and to the one thing I saw in your saying, the fairness issue where, hey, is it fair for the officer to view the camera? I'll accept that argument as soon as we turn around and tell criminals they got to carry a camera with them, because that's different. We're not giving the officer the option of carrying the camera. We mandated that to him. So if we're talking fairness, when the criminal carries a camera and he videos it from his side, then we got a fairness issue.
Well, as far
Absolutely.
as the fairness issue, I mean, private citizens don't get paid to shoot people, officers do.
Right.
You're going to give them bullets, they're going to face that stuff. The perjury thing, you know, what is a lie? It's a statement made with the intent to deceive.
That's the key, the intent part. And in my opinion, I think a lot of those cases you're talking about, I've seen them as well, and that's oftentimes politically driven, and it's a shame. And we've had, back to our use of force instructor program, we have quite a few attorneys that come through, and we would love to get DAs to come through that thing. But if they've got a political motivation to charge somebody, they're going to do it no matter what happens. So that's a shame when that happens. But I think, and you can speak to this, experts can say, you know, the memory isn't infallible. Because they didn't record everything that's on the video does not mean they lied about it. But it's a lot of work for the officer to have to go through that.
Well, and so far as the training, you know, you can train DAs too, and you can embarrass them into doing it. Putting them through shoot houses and stuff is great, okay? Here's how I think you can change their attitudes. Find a 5-foot, 105-pound female officer and put her in a room with mats and get all of your DAs, all of your naysayers, okay, and say she won't kick you, punch you, bite you, or knee you, or headbutt you. You can't do the same to her, and hand them a pair of cuffs and say, now go put these on and start calling for backup when you need it. You will convince them that this street-level stuff that they're talking about is not the way it works on television. They'll understand why an officer winds up shooting somebody because they're completely winded and think they're going to die.
And we've got our local district court judge sends their attorneys, their law clerks, and watches some of our use of force programs. So we're spreading that education part a little bit, but there's so many folks who don't know what they're talking about when it comes to use of force.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I agree with 98% of everything you said, but I'm LAPD and union and respond to the shootings.
Mm-hmm.
The hybrid form, you give the statement, you look at the video, you're already a liar when it comes to a politically hot thing. And in LA, we look at the video, it's the most important thing that this officer is ever going to do, and that we use everything we possibly can to make that statement accurate. And the officer can say, I see it on the video, but I don't remember that, but he still gets to see the video. And I think that the hybrid thing problem is going to be the fact that plaintiff's attorneys and district attorneys and even your own department, even though there's only a 10-minute gap between seeing it and your statement, and then seeing it and changing your statement, can still be horrible for the officer. You're marching them out on a limb and you're hoping.
No, and I appreciate that. I actually think they should watch it ahead of time, but I've got so many agencies that I've dealt with that won't let them that I've suggested the hybrid as an option. And I think you're going to see another trend in law enforcement right now where you see these body cameras of an officer responding to a mentally disturbed subject who's just kind of off the wall. I think that what you're going to see is a lot of agencies looking and saying they're not threatening anybody and getting back in their car and leaving.
That's definitely a trend we've seen in some of the bigger cities are doing that. Are you threatening anybody besides yourself? 10-8. Call me back when something worse happens.
Send the psychologist who criticized the officers out there to take care of them. Any others? Yes, sir. Tim?
Yeah, I understand your point. I think you see the issue that I was trying to raise, is that it depends upon the perspective. You know, if police officers are judged from their own perspective based upon what they knew at the time, then the gorilla's out. You know, it's not something they're going to consider. But nonetheless, you know, if they're considered, and Graham says, totality of the facts and circumstances from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene. And I cannot find anything in the Supreme Court cases that states that the officer's got to know it to make it objectively reasonable. And I think if you do, it just turns an objective standard on its head. That's Tim Miller talking.
You know, and I would add this. You know, we know from research there's stuff the officer is going to see that video and it's going to refresh their recollection. And people say refresh recollection. That's used in courts every day with trials. So when the officer sees something that refreshes their recollection, they can say that's what I remember now seeing the video. When you asked me before, it wasn't important. And a lot of times that'll happen with the stuff that's on the fringes of their peripheral vision. When they started tunneling in, they may not be able to tell you how close people were, but they remember it. Specifically, I had an officer that was able to defend a shot that he took in a crowd. Because he said, you know, I could tell you there was nobody behind him. Well, you were in a crowd. I can tell you there was nobody behind him. Well, you go back and look at a video and you could tell he waited. He actually changed his position to make sure he had a clear backstop. Anyone else? I don't know if they've got to get going, but we'll be up here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.